A very warm welcome to all of our attendees this morning for the Tuesday morning Toolbox Talk. As always, we start with the tips to continually prevent COVID-19. And we've mentioned this before to all of our plumbers. It's not just about COVID-19. There are other biological risks as well as occupational illnesses that you might be exposed to on a daily basis. And so these tips, things like washing your hands regularly with soap and water for 20 seconds, that stops bacteria, disease, funguses, or anything that you might come in contact with from entering your body and making you sick. Many of our plumbers also work with certain chemicals or hazardous chemical substances. So ensuring that you wash your hands regularly so that you're not exposed to those types of dangers are also very important. Now, if you don't have soap and water available at any given time, it is a good suggestion to keep available an alcohol-based hand sanitizer, just so that you can sanitize your hands in case you haven't been able to wash them. Then, if you have not washed your hands, please avoid touching your eyes, nose, and mouth. Adhere to your social distancing measures, especially when people are sick. And then if you do have a cough or a sneeze, many companies still suggest that you stay away from work if you're feeling sick, but others are saying, well, it could just be flu. So what we suggest is to please cover your cough or sneeze with a flexed elbow or your tissue, and then make sure that you bin that tissue as soon as possible. A very good one as well, and I think we've mentioned this a few times. Every Tuesday morning Toolbox Talk, you've logged into, you've heard this: clean and disinfect frequently touched objects and surfaces. Now, this is important, especially because of the tools that we are using, hand tools, power tools, and we're passing it from one person to the next. And oftentimes, where the tools are being used could be used for specific types of work where you are going to be faced with sewers, biological hazards. Perhaps the chemicals that you are working with require tools to work around it, and then you're touching the chemical and the tool. So it would be a good idea not only to wash your hands, but also to wash the tools that you are using so that you don't cross-contaminate it later on. And if you can, please do your part to get vaccinated. Now, this morning's Toolbox Talk is, do you have a safety mindset? And again, we are talking to you about the zero is no accident slogan. This is the slogan that we're going to be adopting throughout the entire year. In fact, we want you to adopt it as well, personally, as an employee, and then as a company as well. Now, why do we say zero is no accident? Well, that is because there is no possible way to have no incidents, accidents, or reportable injuries by accident. It takes preparation, it takes time, it takes a safety mindset. And so we're going to discuss what is a safety mindset in terms of risk, and how do you as a plumber take this mindset and really apply it in the next week while you are working, and then hopefully take the same mindset and apply it not just to this week, but to the rest of your working projects. Because it doesn't just start when we get to site. It should be a mindset that we have as a behavior or as an attitude. And then next week, we're going to be looking at struck by. What are the dangers? So as we mentioned, we're working together with Master Builders Association, the Institute of Working at Heights, FEM, on what is applicable in the industry to plumbers, and how could you get struck by something, and what does struck by actually mean? So we've come up with that definition. And so we want to express to you what is struck by and how can you prevent yourself from being harmed by these. So again, our safety slogan for this week and moving forward: zero is no accident. Now, what does it mean to be safe? Well, safe in terms of the definition from the Occupational Health and Safety Act means free from any danger or free from any hazard, because hazard is the source of or exposure to danger. So essentially, we're saying that to be safe, a person must be kept free from the source of or exposure to any dangers to their health and safety. Now, you might say to yourself, but is that even a possibility? To be safe means that we are not exposed to any dangers. But every single day as a plumber, you're exposed to many dangers. The dangers of working at heights, the dangers of working with electrical power tools, the dangers of climbing into a manhole, into sewers, the dangers of working where other contractors have worked who might not be honest with you about their installation. You see, you as a plumber rely heavily on, let's say, the safety of others. And when we say the safety of others, we're talking about many plumbers will go into situations or installations where another service provider or perhaps another contractor has actually worked on it before. And you are hoping that it is safe enough for you to start working on it. And we do understand there's a big exposure to danger right there. So how are we actually then getting to the point of saying that you have to be safe? Or how do you have a safety mindset when what we're essentially saying is that it's free from danger? Well, let us consider a few things. The definition of reasonably practicable means with regard to the severity and scope of the hazard or risk concerned. So why are we considering this definition? Because the legislation says that you must have a safe working environment. In fact, according to Section 8 of the OSH Act, it states that all employers have a responsibility and a duty to keep their employees safe and to provide a safe working environment. Now, that means, as we mentioned, keeping them free from dangers. But it does say that employers need to be reasonably practicable. So, when it says reasonably practicable, it means that there are going to be situations where you are exposed to a danger, but we need to have regard to what is the severity and scope of that danger. So is it a high risk, low risk? Is it a medium risk? What is the severity? How is it going to affect or impact the person performing that work? How is it going to affect or impact the persons around the working environment? In fact, we even go further than that and say, how is it going to impact the end user of the installation? Now, there's another point to consider when we look at the term reasonable or practical. It is also the state of knowledge that is reasonably available concerning that specific hazard or risk, and then also the means of removing or mitigating that hazard or risk. What are we saying? Well, is there knowledge available concerning the danger that you are exposed to? Almost every single danger that you come across every day has some particular piece of information or document attached to why that danger exists and how we can reasonably remove or mitigate that hazard. Removing means basically eliminating it completely, and mitigating it means making it as safe as possible. So the law is saying that we want a safe working environment, but something needs to be put in place. As we mentioned, when we said zero is no accident, zero incidents, zero harm, zero damage doesn't come by accident. It comes by proper planning. You have to put time and effort into this type of risk management plan. Either to see, can I remove the risk totally? Is that a possibility? Or do I have to just make it safer or as safe as possible? Now, if you think to yourself, I work with a hazardous chemical substance, well, there's a whole regulation on hazardous chemical substances. Perhaps you work with asbestos. Well, there's the asbestos regulations. Well, what about working inside a manhole? Well, a manhole consists of working above a fall risk. So as soon as you open that manhole, there's a possibility to fall inside. And so we would look at general working at heights. Climbing into a manhole means you are working in a type of confined space environment. And so we look at the confined space requirements. Then depending on what you find inside of that manhole, you might be exposed to other risks, such as methane gas. But then you have the requirements of working inside a manhole with that exposure on a specific document. Now, you might be saying or sitting there thinking, well, geez, Chris, I'm a plumber. I have to read all the SAN standards and codes. I have to be up to date with all legislation to make sure my installation's in place. Are you telling me I have to go and do all this research now on every single other risk and hazard that I'm exposed to? Well, to a degree, the law says you have to have reasonable, available knowledge concerning those hazards and risks? Well, take the time and find out what risks are you exposed to. And then you don't have to read the entire legislation. You can read the legislation that is applicable only to you. Now, you might think to yourself, that's a lot of reading. But if you consider just your risk assessment for the work that you are performing, so just the risk assessment to state, these are the risks, these are the hazards, and this is the control measures in place, that already gives you the legislative ideas on what to do in order to remove or mitigate that risk. Risk assessments range. They vary from, let's say, 2 to 3 pages to 50 to 60 pages. I've done one that was 150 pages long, but that was a massive site with about 6 different contractors. So yes, it depends on the scope and severity of the risk concerned. So if you are at a lower risk or a lower severity, less reading, less materials will be needed. But if you are performing higher risk, it means more dedicated time to ensuring you understand the knowledge that is reasonably available for you. Now, the next 2 things, it is the availability and suitability of means to remove or mitigate that hazard. So there might be a means of removing a specific hazard for you. And let's put it into a practical term. When working at heights, you need to install a geyser on a wall. All right, so you're installing the geyser on a wall. It's going to be anchored into that wall. It's about 4 meters up. Now, I'm not too sure on your SANS codes. You also have to make sure that that installation is in accordance with the SANS codes on where on the wall that's going to be. But let's say, how do you get up to that wall? Because now you're working at heights. Well, working at heights says you're allowed to work on a ladder. You're allowed to work on a scaffold. You're allowed to work on a rooftop or a height platform, as well as a mobile elevated working platform, like a cherry pick or a scissors lift. Now, if you thought to yourself, which of these working at heights categories are the safest to work on? Well, the availability of the means to mitigate the hazard of falling would be a cherry picker or a scissors lift. You see, it's a cage that keeps you inside of it. It's a platform, and that platform just moves to a specific height and still keeps the employee inside of a platform. Essentially, they cannot get to an area where there's a possibility to fall because there's no exposed edges, like being on a ladder, or perhaps being on a rooftop where there's no barricading. So a scissors lift in this instance would be very safe. A scaffold would also be very safe. But a ladder would not be as safe. But now please have a look at what we need to consider. The availability and suitability. Now, where you are working, is it suitable to have a cherry picker? You see, we can't just say, well, you're working at a height, you have to have a cherry picker. We can't do that because although that is the safest means of working at heights, it might not be suitable to the task you are performing. So this is what reasonably practicable means. You as the expert, as the plumber performing the work, need to give information to those who understand risk management, and the 2 of us need to discuss what is the best form of elimination or mitigation of the risk. So having a safety mindset means that you need to take your expertise into consideration and then discuss it with someone who comes from a health and safety perspective. And then you have what you say is an agreement in terms of reasonably practicable means for mitigation of risk. Then we also look at the cost of removing that, the cost in relation to the benefits that we derive from them. And this is gains and loss. This is also included in financial gain. Now, we know we often say in the safety industry, there should be no budget for safety. Whatever you can put in place, you must put in place to save a person's life. That is 100% true. We will always advocate that. But remember, we're looking at the severity of the hazard. If it's not a possibility for the person to die or have a fatal incident because of the risk, well, then we need to look at the benefits derived from putting in some sort of mitigation cost compared to what are we gaining from that mitigation. And so they're also saying to businesses, you need to be reasonable and practical, both with the knowledge that you have, the state of the risk that you're going to face, and the costs that you need to outlay in order to ensure this is in place. This is a lot to consider, which means if you haven't taken the time out to actually consider what is reasonably practicable for you as a company, then you haven't given enough time or enough planning to your safety mindset in the company. Now, remember we said you have to consider these things. For instance, the severity and scope of the hazard. A risk means the probability that injury or damage will occur. In other words, the hazard is the source of the danger, and the risk says how likely or how probable is that danger likely to turn into an injury or ill health. This is where a risk assessment program comes in. It is a program to determine any risk associated with a hazard, the actual danger, in order to identify the steps needed to be taken to remove, reduce, or control such hazards. Now, if you're not a risk assessor or you haven't been trained in risk assessment, you might not understand how this is done. Again, this is where two minds come together, the plumbing expertise and the health and safety expertise. And together we can come and identify what are the specific hazards that are affecting you as plumbers. What are you exposed to on a daily basis where when you're working, they say it's not in accordance with the safety file or the safe working procedure, but you're saying the safe working procedure is wrong because you can't do it that way. It's not reasonably practical. But it means that we need the information from you. We need the engagement from our plumbers. And so we are really urging you to reach out to us. Tell us what you are experiencing, what you are facing. In fact, we want to say thank you very much to the plumbers who have reached out, because by means of the reaching out from your side, we've developed other types of risk management systems that we can give out as templates to our plumbers. But have you read these templates? Have you changed the templates to suit your scope? Now, what we want to do a little bit more this year, and we will be discussing it more as we go along throughout the year with all of our plumbing members at our OPSA, is to come to site with you. We want to be on site. We want to put on our safety workwear. We want to put out on our PPE that is required by you or your site, and come into the trench with your team and figure out where is the gap. Is there a gap in terms of the documentation? Is there a gap in terms of the knowledge, the availability of the knowledge, the availability of the means to mitigate it? Or is there just a benefit or loss that we are not considering? And what we want to achieve is identifying the steps needed to remove, reduce, or control the hazards that our member plumbers are facing. So have you taken the time? Have you actually sat and taken the time to evaluate 100%? What are the risks that I'm actually facing? What are my teams facing while on site? Which would mean that you might need to get information from the team, from the person doing the physical work. If you are the person doing the physical work, you need to have open lines of communication with upper management. You also need to have open lines of communication with us here at our OPSA, safety@ouropsa.org. You may remain anonymous if you wish. Send us an email, send us a WhatsApp, tell us what's happening on site. We're not here to look for disagreements. We're not a complaints department. But what we are is a department to be able to assist you as the member plumber to identify and control the risks that you are actually facing. Not in a, well, let's thumb suck what we should be doing and then have a blanket rule to all of our plumbers. If you're working at height, you have to use the safest means of possible, either a cherry pick or a scaffold, because that might not be applicable in your case. You might have to use a ladder. But if you have to use a ladder, what we want to do is make 100% sure that you are safe in the use of that ladder. That is our objective. That is our goal. Because even though you're using something that is less safe than perhaps a scaffold, you can still be as safe as possible on that ladder. We are not saying that you are taking your life into your own hands. We are just saying that there is knowledge reasonably available concerning working on ladders. Using ladders, there are also available and suitable means of removing and mitigating risks while working on a ladder. And we can have a look at the cost of removing or mitigating those hazards in relation to the benefits of working from ladders. If you have your risk assessments in place, if you have taken the time out to evaluate what those risks are, and if you are really determined to have a zero is no accident mindset. Now let's look at a few definitions before we end off today. Elimination is the complete elimination of a hazard by design. In other words, we have designed the work to eliminate a specific hazard. It doesn't mean that you got to site and all of a sudden that hazard doesn't exist. It is designed. In other words, it's planned and prepared for. We've done something. We've designed a method in order to eliminate a specific hazard. If we cannot do that, we either substitute or minimize it. This is replacing the hazard, material, or process with something less hazardous, or significantly reducing the magnitude of the hazard or material so the consequences are greatly reduced. We can even engineer or design in controls or redesign the equipment or work process in order to minimize the risk or exposure to the person performing the work. We can also separate, that is placing a physical barrier on the hazard, such as guarding it or enclosing it. Now, if you separate the person from the hazard, you are also achieving some sort of mitigation strategy. And then the final two, we will always need to have administrative protocols. There will always need to be documentation in place. So providing things such as training and procedures in order to back up what you want to do on site. And last but not least, it's a mandatory thing, but it is something that is the last form of protection, and that is PPE. Now, please remember, it is not just PPE. It is appropriate and properly fitted PPE. In other words, it has to be personal protective equipment. Personal, it is fitted to the person who is using it. It is adequate and appropriate for the type of work being performed, and it is specific to the hazard that we are facing as well. So what is a risk assessment? Well, it is the process for evaluating the risk to an employee's health and safety from the workplace hazards, and it is a systematic assessment of all aspects of work. It is a complete hazard identification of all the work that you as a plumber are exposed to, identifying any person who might be exposed to each of your hazards that you identify. Then we take a look at how the person is affected. Is it an ill health or is it an injury on duty? Then we analyze and evaluate the risk, and we prioritize those risks. So again, we are asking you as member plumbers, because coming up for 2023, we want your feedback. We want to come through to you. As we mentioned before, we're going to be doing site visits. We are coming to your offices. We are coming to your sites. And if possible, we would love to be your safety representative on a site where your client allows us in on a project that you are working on. We want to visit the IOPSA approved training centers. We're going to be designing hot topic safety discussions. Now, these are going to be recorded and you can watch it at any time. These discussions are going to be on what is actually happening in the plumbing industry, what is happening in the trenches, on the ground, in those manholes, working at heights with your installations. What are you facing? And how can we mitigate those challenges? So please, we want to meet you at the plumbers' evenings. We want to have discussions with you, and we want your feedback. So again, safety@iopsa.org. And please remember, we are doing this statistical analysis with Institute of Working at Heights, FEM, Master Builders Association. We are looking for your assistance. we need to find out what incidents and accidents are occurring within the plumbing industry. As we mentioned, next week, we are going to be discussing struck by incidents and accidents. We'll give you the definition of that, what it means, so that we can get your feedback. But please, any incident, anything, a near miss, a first aid case, a hospitalization, a fatality, we want to know all that information and what occurred. Now, there is a link that asks you a few questions just so that we can figure out what actually happened. There's an area where you can put your name, but it's not required. You can just leave it blank if you want to. Or you can just put in plumber. It's 100% up to you. You can remain anonymous. We're not using your names or email addresses or anything like that. We're only looking for the information on the actual incident so that we can design proper methodologies in order to help you to stop that from happening again. So again, get in touch, safety@iopsa.org. Send an email to info@ohss.co.za or send us a WhatsApp on 071-875-2070. Thank you very much. And please remember, zero is no accident. We'll see you again next week, Tuesday.